The afternoon sun cast long, sleepy shadows across the main street of a town that time seemed to have politely forgotten. It was the kind of place where the loudest sounds were usually the town's single traffic, light changing color, or the friendly jingle of the bell on the door of Maggie's diner. Inside, the air was thick with the comforting smells of sizzling bacon, fresh brewed coffee, and the sweet, warm scent of apple pie. It was a sanctuary for the regulars, a place where the world outside and all its troubles couldn't reach you. In his usual corner booth sat a man who seemed as much a part of the diner as the red vinyl seats and the chrome-edged tables. His name was Arthur Peterson, and to the folks in town, he was just Arthur, the quiet old man who came in every day. At 3 o'clock sharp for a slice of pie and a black coffee, he was in his 90s, a fact that showed in the deep lines that crisscrossed his face like a roadmap of a long life, and in the slight tremor in his hands as he lifted his coffee cup. But there was a stillness about him, a centered calm that felt like the roots of an ancient, sturdy tree. His back was straight, his posture proud, a relic from a time when men were taught to carry themselves with a certain discipline. Even when no one was watching, on the lapel of his old but impeccably clean tweed jacket, a small enameled pin glinted under the fluorescent lights. It was a screaming eagle, the proud symbol of the 101st Airborne. Most of the younger folks didn't recognize it, and the older ones who did knew better than to bring it up unless Arthur did first. He was not a man who lived in the past, but the past, it was clear, lived in him. He'd seen things, done things, that were woven into the very fabric of his being. Now those things were quiet, tucked away behind a gentle smile and a polite nod to the waitress, Maggie herself. A woman whose own face was a testament to a life of hard work and kindness, brought over his order. "Here you go, Arthur. One piece of my best, and a coffee black as night." She set the plate and mug down with a familiar, practiced ease. "Anything exciting happen today?" Arthur looked up at her, his blue eyes clear and surprisingly sharp. "The sun came up, Maggie," he said, his voice a little raspy with age but firm. "That's exciting enough for me." She chuckled and patted his shoulder before moving off to check on her other customers. Arthur took a sip of his coffee, letting the hot, bitter liquid warm him. He picked up his fork, preparing to enjoy his simple, perfect routine. His small island of peace in a world that had grown so loud and fast. The peace began to fray at the edges, not with a bang, but with a low, distant rumble. It was a sound that didn't belong in the quiet fabric of the town. It was aggressive, a guttural growl that seemed to get under the skin, vibrating through the floor and up the legs of the tables. A few diners paused, forks halfway to their mouths, and looked toward the large front windows. The rumble grew louder, more insistent, a dozen angry hornets swarming toward them. It was the sound of motorcycles, but not the friendly putt-putt of a weekend rider. This was the sound of raw, untamed power, deliberately loud. The roar peaked right outside the diner, a wall of noise that made the salt and pepper shakers on the tables tremble. Then, one by one, the engines cut out, leaving a ringing silence that felt heavier and more uncomfortable than the noise itself. The bell on the door jangled violently, and the town's quiet was officially broken. 6 of them strode in, framed in the doorway like actors on a stage. They were a chaotic mix of black leather, faded denim, and greasy tattooed skin. They moved with a practiced swagger, a look in their eyes that said they owned any room they walked into. They didn't just enter the diner, they invaded it. Their heavy boots thudded on the linoleum floor, their laughter was a series of loud, barking sounds, and they immediately filled the small space with their energy. It was the energy of disrespect. The one in the lead was a younger man, maybe, in his late 20s, with a cocky, self-satisfied smirk plastered on his face. He had a greasy ponytail and a thick silver chain around his neck that matched the large viper's patch on the back of his leather vest. This was Spike, the alpha of his small pack. He and his men were the local toughs, the kind of young men who mistook intimidation for power. They looked around the diner, not as patrons, but as wolves surveying a sheep pen. The other diners a quiet couple. A truck driver, a mother and her teenage son all seemed to shrink in their seats. They looked down at their plates, their coffee cups, anywhere but at the newcomers. The air grew thick with unspoken tension. Maggie, behind the counter, put on her best customer service smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. The bikers ignored the empty tables and instead congregated near the counter, talking loudly, their words peppered with casual profanity. They bumped into each other, shoved the sugar dispenser back and forth, and acted as if they were the only people who mattered. Their performance was for an audience they didn't care about, and for each other. They were here to be seen, to be feared. Spike's eyes eventually scanned the room again, this time looking for a new target for their amusement. His gaze passed over the hunched shoulders of the other customers and landed on the one person who didn't seem to be reacting. Arthur. Sitting in his corner booth, calm as can be, methodically eating his pie. To Spike, this quiet dignity was an insult. It was a challenge. This old man, this relic, was not impressed. And that was unacceptable. With a nudge to one of his buddies, Spike started making his way over to the corner booth. The others followed, a slow-moving, menacing tide. They didn't walk directly toward him, but meandered in a way that made it impossible for anyone in their path not to feel threatened. They stopped at the table next to Arthur's, crowding the space. Spike leaned against the partition, his bulky frame blocking the light. He stared down at Arthur, a sneer playing on his lips. Arthur felt the shift in the air, but he didn't look up. He simply took another small, deliberate bite of his pie, chewing it slowly, as if savoring it. His lack of reaction was like pouring gasoline on Spike's fire. The biker leaned over, getting right into Arthur's space, his breath smelling of stale cigarettes. "Heard they have good pie here," Spike said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You gonna share, Grandpa?" One of the other bikers snickered. Arthur still didn't look up. He just took a sip of his coffee, his hand remarkably steady. This non-response infuriated Spike. He wasn't used to being ignored. He straightened up and took a deliberate step backward, accidentally bumping the edge of Arthur's table with his heavy boot. The table jolted violently. Arthur's full mug of coffee tipped over, spilling its scalding hot contents across the table and directly into the old man's lap. The hot liquid soaked through Arthur's trousers instantly. A sharp hiss of pain escaped his lips, a quiet, involuntary sound of a body that could no longer tolerate such shocks. For the first time, his calm was broken. He pushed himself back slightly from the table, his face tightening in a grimace of pain. Spike's reaction was not one of apology. It was a triumphant laugh. It was a cruel, ugly sound that echoed in the dead-silent diner. "Well, look at that," Spike said, feigning shock. "You should be more careful, old man. Things get spilled when you're not paying attention." The other bikers joined in his laughter, their eyes glinting with malicious glee. They had gotten the reaction they wanted. They had asserted their dominance, had proven they could disrupt this peaceful little world whenever they wanted. They had humiliated the old man. The other patrons watched in horrified silence. The mother put a protective arm around her son. The truck driver stared down into his plate, his jaw tight. No one said a word. No one moved. Slowly, Arthur pushed his chair back and stood up. The front of his trousers were dark and dripping with coffee. He didn't say anything. He didn't even look at Spike. He just calmly took a napkin from the dispenser and began to dab at the wet stain on his trousers. His movements were slow, measured, and completely devoid of panic or anger. Spike, annoyed that the old man wasn't cowering or begging, leaned in close again. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue," he jeered. He pointed a grimy finger directly at the screaming eagle pin on Arthur's jacket. "Or are you just living in the past, old soldier? That war's been over for a long time. Nobody cares anymore." Arthur finished dabbing at the stain. He meticulously folded the wet napkin and placed it on the table. Then, for the first time, he looked up. His blue eyes met Spike's, and for a brief moment, the younger man flinched. There was no fear in those eyes. There was no pleading. There was something else. A cold, still fury, a flicker of a memory of a much harder time. A look of a man who had stared down true evil and found it wanting. It was a look that made Spike's mockery feel small and pathetic. Arthur held the gaze for a long, silent moment. Then his expression softened back into a mask of quiet calm. With his hand still trembling slightly from age, he reached inside his tweed jacket and pulled out an old, beat-up flip phone. He flipped. It opened the screen, casting a faint blue light on his weathered face. His fingers, which had struggled with the coffee mug just moments ago, moved with a sure, practiced memory, punching in a number. He brought the phone to his ear, his eyes never leaving Spike's face. Asterisk, the silence that fell over Maggie's diner was heavier than any sound that had come before it. It was a thick, suffocating blanket of tension. Every person in the room was frozen, caught in a scene they hadn't asked for, a drama that was playing out far too close to their own safe, little lives. Their eyes were all fixed on the same point, the old man standing in the corner. A small black phone pressed to his ear. The bikers. The Vipers were the only ones still trying to project an air of casual defiance, but even their confidence had a new uncertain edge to it. Spike stood with his arms crossed over his chest, trying to look bored, but his eyes kept darting back to the phone and the old man's unnervingly calm face. His buddies fidgeted, shifting their weight, their smirks now looking more like nervous tics. They had come in here to be the loudest thing in the room, to be the center of attention. Now the entire diner's focus was on this quiet, elderly man and his mysterious phone call, and they had been reduced to a confusing and unsettling side note. Arthur spoke into the phone, his voice a low, steady rumble that was just loud enough to cut through the quiet hum of the kitchen. The words were simple, but the way he said them carried an authority that no one in the diner, least of all the bikers, could ignore. "It's Arthur," he said. He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. "I'm at Maggie's." "Yeah, on the main strip. Got a problem?" There was no panic in his tone, no urgency. He was stating a fact, as simple as saying the sky was blue. A young crew. The Vipers. They're being ... disrespectful. The last word was chosen carefully, spoken with a calm finality that made it sound like a judgment, not a complaint. Another pause. He listened intently, his gaze still locked on Spike, who was now shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. It was a strange kind of standoff. The loud, aggressive bikers were being silently held hostage by the quiet intensity of a phone call. They couldn't hear the other person, but they could feel the weight of the conversation, and it was pressing down on them. "No," Arthur continued into the phone, his voice dropping even lower. "They don't know who I am." He looked directly at Spike's confused, angry face. For a second, his eyes seemed to soften with a flicker of something that looked almost like pity. "Bring a few of the boys," he said, his voice firming up again. "This needs to be a lesson." That was it. The conversation was over. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't offer any pleasantries. He simply flipped the phone shut with a sharp, definitive click. The sound echoed in the silent diner, like the cocking of a gun. Arthur then, with the same unhurried, deliberate movements he had used before, placed the phone back into the inside pocket of his jacket. He patted it once, a gentle final tap. The entire sequence of events, the call, the words, the final, decisive click, had taken less than 2 minutes. But it had changed the atmosphere completely. The bikers were no longer in control of the room. They were waiting, just like everyone else, to see what would happen next. Spike, feeling the eyes of his crew on him, knew he had to do something. He couldn't just stand there and let this old man weird them out with a phone call. He had to re-establish his dominance. He forced a nasty grin back onto his face, trying to reclaim the arrogance that had been so easily stripped away. "So who was that, Grandpa?" he sneered, taking a step closer. "Calling your mommy to come and pick you up? Did you tell her the big mean bikers were mean to you?" He looked back at his friends for support, but they just stared at him, their faces blank. The joke landed with a thud, completely failing to break the tension. Arthur didn't answer. He didn't even seem to have heard the taunt. He slowly pulled out his chair and sat back down, wincing slightly as the wet, coffee-stained fabric of his trousers touched the vinyl seat. He looked at the mess on his table, the spilled coffee, the half-eaten slice of pie, the folded, wet napkin, and then he looked back at Spike. There was no anger in his expression. There was no fear. There was only a quiet, waiting certainty. It was as if he had just made a dinner reservation. and was now patiently waiting for his guests to arrive. This calm confidence was infuriating to Spike. It was a kind of power he didn't understand and couldn't fight. He couldn't intimidate a man who wasn't intimidated. He couldn't frighten someone who was just... He felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up his neck. He and his friends looked like a bunch of bullies who had been put in a timeout. The entire diner was watching them, not with fear anymore, but with a kind of morbid curiosity. Spike's mind raced, trying to figure out a way out of this. Who could the old man have called? The cops? No, that didn't make sense. He hadn't sounded like he was calling the police. He sounded like he was calling family or old friends. And the way he said, "Bring a few of the boys," it sounded personal, not official. It was a puzzle he couldn't solve, and his inability to solve it made him feel foolish. "All right, old-timer. You had your fun," Spike said, his voice losing some of its edge. "We're leaving. You've ruined the appetite for pie anyway." It was a weak attempt to save face, an excuse to retreat from a situation that had become far more complicated than he had intended. He turned to his crew, jerking his head toward the door. "Let's get out of this dump." But as they started to move, a new sound began to drift in from outside. It was the deep, rhythmic thumping of motorcycle engines. But this was different from the chaotic, aggressive roar of the Vipers. This sound was organized. It was a unified, powerful heartbeat, the sound of multiple engines all running in perfect, intimidating sync. The ground seemed to vibrate with it, a low thrum that you felt in your chest as much as you heard with your ears. The Vipers froze at the door, their hands on the handles. They turned back, their eyes wide, looking toward Arthur. The sound grew louder and louder, not like an approaching storm, but like an army moving into position. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. The abrupt silence that followed was just as loud as the noise had been. It was the sound of an arrival. Every head in the diner turned to the door. The bell jangled again, but this time it was a single, soft chime. The door swung open, and a man filled the doorway. He was, in a word, immense. He was built like an old oak tree, with broad shoulders, a thick chest, and a long, gray beard that flowed down over a leather vest adorned with patches. His eyes, set under a heavy brow, were the color of a winter sky, cold and utterly serious. Behind him, a line of other bikers filed in, one after another. They were all older men, their faces weathered by time and experience. Their leathers were worn but clean. Their bikes parked outside were spotless, powerful machines. These weren't rowdy kids looking for trouble. They were something else entirely. They were a brotherhood, a unit, and they were there with a purpose. The leader's eyes scanned the room methodically, professionally. They passed over the huddled patrons, over the terrified Vipers at the door, and finally they found Arthur. The hard, serious look in the leader's eyes melted away instantly. It was replaced by something deep and genuine, profound respect. He gave a slow, deliberate nod to the old man, a nod that said, "We're here." Arthur simply nodded back, a small, almost imperceptible movement of his head. The leader then turned his full attention to the Vipers. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to fill every corner of the diner. "You fellows seem to be causing a disturbance," he said, his tone flat, devoid of all emotion. He took a step inside, his heavy boots making no sound on the floor, as if he were gliding. The men behind him moved with him, fanning out slightly, a silent, intimidating wall of leather and muscle. "And you're bothering a friend of mine," Spike, who had been feeling like a big fish in a small pond just 10 minutes ago, now felt like a minnow staring down a whale. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry as dust. He tried to summon some of his earlier bravado, but it was gone, vanished in the face of this real, undeniable power. "We were just having some fun," Spike managed to stammer, his voice a pathetic squeak. "Who is this old dude to you anyway?" The leader's face darkened. He didn't raise his voice, but the coldness in it intensified, sending a chill through the entire room. He took another step, now standing directly in front of Spike. He was so close that Spike could smell the faint scent of leather and clean air on him. "This old dude," the leader said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that was more terrifying than any yell, "is Sergeant Arthur Peterson." He let the name hang in the air, watching as it registered on Spike's face, followed by confusion. He helped establish this chapter back in '78. He taught us everything about honor, about loyalty, about the true meaning of the word brotherhood. He leaned in even closer, his beard almost touching Spike's face. "While you were just a thought in your daddy's head, he was parachuting into Normandy. He was leading his men through the frozen hell of the Battle of the Bulge. You don't have the right to even breathe the same air as him." He looked Spike up and down with a look of utter contempt. "You are nothing." He paused, letting the weight of his words crush the young biker's spirit completely. Spike stood frozen, his face pale, his arrogant posture slumped into a defeated cower. The leader straightened up to his full, imposing height. "You and your friends have 1 minute to get on your knees and apologize to this man," he said, his voice returning to its normal rumbling level. "And then you will leave this town and never come back. If you don't, I promise you, you and your little playground club will wish you had never heard the name Viper." The air in Maggie's diner was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Every sound, from the low hum of the milkshake machine in the back to the frantic beating of a dozen frightened hearts, seemed amplified in the crushing silence. The younger bikers, the Vipers, stood by the door like statues carved from fear. The cocksure swagger that had defined them minutes ago was shattered, replaced by a wide-eyed, trembling disbelief. They were like kids who had been caught vandalizing a tomb, suddenly realizing the weight of what they had done. The mountain of a man who had confronted them, Brick, stood his ground, an immovable object of righteous fury.
Ow.
His words had not just been a threat, they had been a judgment. He had peeled back the layers of their cheap, leather-clad identities and revealed the frightened, insecure boys beneath. The name he had spoken, Sergeant Arthur Peterson, had been a key, unlocking a reality they never could have imagined. At the center of it all, in his corner booth, sat Arthur. He hadn't moved a muscle since the newcomers had arrived. He simply watched the scene unfold, his expression unreadable, his hands resting calmly on the table in front of him. He was the eye of the storm, the quiet reason for all this chaos. The other diners, who had been just a backdrop to the Vipers' earlier performance, were now a captivated audience. Their fear had been replaced by a fascinated, almost reverent awe. They were witnessing something extraordinary. The truck driver, who had looked so meek before, now sat up straighter, a flicker of pride in his eyes. The teenage boy, who had been hiding behind his mother, was now peering over the top of the booth, his eyes wide with wonder. Brick took a step back from Spike, giving him a little space. The 1-minute clock had started, though no one dared to check their watch. The silence stretched, each second feeling like an eternity. Spike looked at his friends, his eyes pleading, but they offered no support. They just stared back at him, their faces pale, their bodies rigid. They were waiting for him to make the move, to find a way out of the corner he had backed them all into. But there was no way out. There was no clever retort, no tough guy act that could possibly work here. This wasn't a game anymore. Brick's men, the older bikers, had formed a silent, living wall across the diner. They didn't look angry or bloodthirsty. They just looked determined. They stood with their arms crossed or their hands resting on their belts, their eyes fixed on the Vipers. It wasn't a show of force for the sake of intimidation. It was the quiet, steady presence of men who knew their purpose and were prepared to see it through. They were like sentinels guarding a sacred ground, and that ground was Arthur's table. The pressure on Spike became unbearable. He could feel the weight of Brick's stare, the silent judgment of the older bikers, and the curious eyes of the entire diner. He looked past Brick, his gaze landing on the old man. Arthur was looking right at him, and in that moment, Spike didn't see a frail, harmless old man, saw the glint of something in those blue eyes, a shadow of the soldier Brick had described. He saw the ghost of a leader of men, a man who had faced down tanks and artillery, a man who had stared into the abyss and not blinked. In that one look, Spike understood. He understood the gulf between them, It was a boy playing at being tough, and Arthur was the real thing. The fight, if there had ever been one, went out of him completely. His shoulders slumped. The angry red color drained from his neck, leaving his skin pasty and white. He looked down at the floor, at his own heavy boots, suddenly feeling ridiculous in them. All the posturing, all the noise, all the cheap threats, it all evaporated in the face of this quiet, undeniable truth. Slowly, as if his legs were made of lead, he began to walk toward Arthur's booth. His movements were clumsy, ashamed. He didn't swagger, shuffled. The heavy chain around his neck felt like a yoke. The leather vest felt like a costume. With each step, he was shedding the identity he had so carefully constructed, leaving pieces of it on the linoleum floor. One of his friends, a lanky kid with a bad tattoo of a snake on his neck, seemed to want to say something, a whispered "don't," but the words died in his throat. The other vipers watched him go. Trapped between the door and the silent wall of older bikers, they knew they were next. They knew they would have to follow his lead. Spike stopped a few feet from Arthur's table. He couldn't bring himself to look the old man in the eye. His gaze was fixed on the worn, laminated surface of the table at the ring of coffee that had started to form. He took a shaky breath, the air catching in his throat. He could feel Brick's eyes on him, but that wasn't what mattered anymore. The only opinion that mattered in that room belonged to the quiet man sitting in the booth. He dropped to his knees. It wasn't a slow, graceful movement. It was a clumsy collapse, as if his legs could no longer support the weight of his own foolishness. His jeans made a soft thumping sound on the floor. He knelt there, head bowed, the very picture of defeat. The other diners let out a collective, almost silent gasp. It was a shocking sight, the loud, arrogant biker, now on his knees before the elderly man he had tormented. "Sir," Spike began, his voice a choked whisper, thick with a shame so potent it was almost painful to hear. The word "sir" hung in the air, a complete and total surrender. I am so sorry." He swallowed hard, trying to keep his composure. "We were wrong. We were stupid and disrespectful." He finally risked a look up, his eyes meeting Arthur's for a brief second before looking away again. "Please forgive me." The words echoed in the profound silence of the diner. This was the apology they all knew Arthur had deserved, the one that no one had been brave enough to demand. It wasn't forced out of him by a threat of violence, but by a dawning, crushing understanding. Arthur didn't say anything. He didn't offer forgiveness or words of scorn. He simply gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of absolution, but one of acknowledgement. The apology was accepted. The matter was closed. For Arthur, that was enough. One by one, the other vipers followed Spike's lead. They shuffled forward, their faces full of the same dawning horror and regret. They each knelt, one after another, forming a pathetic little line of penitence in front of the booth. A few of them mumbled their own apologies, their voices cracking. Others just knelt in silence, their bowed heads saying more than words ever could. After the last one had knelt and been acknowledged with a silent nod, Brick's voice cut through the quiet. "Get up." The vipers scrambled to their feet, eager to escape the suffocating weight of their own shame. Brick pointed a thick, steady finger toward the door. "Now you pay for your meal, and you get out. Don't come back to this town. Ever." Spike, his face still burning with humiliation, fumbled for his wallet. He pulled out a wad of crumpled bills and slammed a $100 bill on the counter in front of Maggie, who was watching the whole scene with her arms folded. "4 for the pie," he mumbled. "And everyone else's." He didn't wait for change. He turned and practically fled the diner, his friends right behind him. The bell on the door jangled one last time as they stumbled out into the late afternoon sun. A few seconds later, the sound of their motorcycles roared to life, but this time the sound was different. It wasn't the aggressive, chest-thumping noise from before. It was a frantic, desperate noise, the sound of animals running from a predator. The roar faded quickly down the main street, leaving a profound and ringing silence in its wake. The silence lasted for a good 10 seconds. No one moved. No one spoke. They were all still processing what they had just seen. Then, the truck driver slowly began to clap, It was a single, loud clap, followed by another and another. Soon, the rest of the diners joined in, a quiet, respectful applause that wasn't for a show. But for a moment of true justice, Brick turned to his men and gave a small, almost invisible nod. They understood. He walked toward Arthur's booth, his heavy steps now seeming lighter, his entire presence softer. He stopped by the table, his massive frame a stark contrast to the frail old man. "You okay, Sarge?" he asked, his voice now warm and gentle, a stark contrast to the gravelly threat he had used on the Vipers. Arthur looked up at him, and a faint, tired, but deeply satisfied smile finally touched his lips. It was the first real expression of emotion anyone had seen from him all day. "I am now Brick," Arthur said, his voice still a little raspy. "Thank you." Brick just nodded again, his own face softening into a look of deep, unwavering respect. "Any time, Arthur. Any time." The final look around the diner. As if to make sure the peace was fully restored, Brick and his men turned and walked out. They left as quietly as they had arrived, their silent departure a final statement of their character. They hadn't come for a fight. They had come to restore balance. Now that it was done, they were gone. The diner began to breathe again. People started talking in hushed, excited tones. The teenage boy was looking at his mom with a look of pure hero worship. Maggie came out from behind the counter, carrying a fresh mug of coffee and a brand new, untouched slice of pie. "House, Arthur," she said, setting them down in front of him. "I think you've earned it." Arthur looked at the fresh pie, then at the $100 bill still sitting on the counter. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from the very bottom of his chest. He picked up his fork and took a bite of the new slice of pie. It tasted sweeter than any he had ever had before. The peace had not just been restored. It had been reinforced, protected by an old soldier and the loyal brotherhood he had inspired long ago. And in that quiet little diner, for a little while at least, everything was exactly as it should be. Asterisk. The silence that followed the departure of the two biker gangs was different from the silence that had fallen before. The first silence had been a nod of fear, a shared, breathless pause, while everyone waited for a hammer to fall. This new silence was a soft, settling dust, a collective exhale after a storm had passed. It was a space filled with unspoken questions, a sense of wonder, and a new, profound respect for the quiet old man in the corner booth. The low murmur of conversation started up again. But it was changed. It wasn't the usual easy chatter about local news or the price of gas. People were talking in hushed, almost reverent tones, their eyes flicking over to Arthur's booth every few seconds. The story was already being rewritten in their minds, passed from one table to the next in whispers and glances. He wasn't just Arthur anymore, the nice old man who liked pie. He was a legend, a sleeping giant who had shown them all what true strength looked like. Arthur, for his part, seemed to shrink back into himself. The intense, focused energy that had held the room in its grip was gone, replaced by a gentle weariness. He ate the fresh slice of pie Maggie had brought him with slow, careful bites, as if savoring not just the taste, but the return of his peace. The $100 bill left by the Vipers still sat on the counter, a quiet testament to the strange and powerful events of the afternoon. Maggie hadn't touched it. She just bustled around, wiping down tables that were already clean, her movements humming with a nervous, excited energy. Outside, the sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. A few curious townsfolk who had heard the rumble of the engines lingered on the opposite sidewalk, trying to piece together the story from the outside. The street was quiet now. The only signs of the earlier chaos, the faint tire tracks on the asphalt. Arthur finished his pie and pushed the plate away. He took a long, slow sip of the fresh coffee, letting the warmth seep into his bones. He felt the eyes of the diner on him, but he didn't mind. He was used to being watched. He just wasn't used to being watched with such awe. It was a strange feeling, and one he wasn't entirely comfortable with. He had spent a lifetime trying to leave the past behind, to live quietly in the world he had fought to protect. Today, the past had reached out and pulled him right back into the spotlight. He pushed his chair back and stood up, his legs a little stiff from sitting. He wasn't as spry as he used to be, and the day's emotional roller coaster had taken its toll. He reached into his pocket to pull out his wallet to pay for the meal, but as he did, the bell on the diner door jangled again. Every head in the diner turned, expecting to see maybe a police officer, or perhaps another of the older bikers who had been left behind. But it was none of those. It was a young woman, probably in her mid-20s, with a camera hanging around her neck and a small, digital voice recorder in her hand. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her eyes were bright with an energetic, determined light. She looked a little out of place in the small-town diner. Like a city person who had taken a wrong turn and stumbled into a story, she paused for a second, her eyes scanning the room. She seemed to sense that something had just happened, that the air was still crackling with an unresolved energy. Her gaze landed on Arthur, who was now standing by his booth, and she saw the way everyone else was looking at him. A look of understanding, of a journalist's instinct, flashed across her face. This was her story. She walked over to him, her steps quick and purposeful. She wasn't nervous like the other patrons. She was focused. She stopped a respectful distance away from him. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice clear and professional. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm a reporter for the regional paper. I was driving through town and, well, it seems I missed something." Arthur just looked at her, his expression neutral. He wasn't used to being approached by reporters. He hadn't spoken to one since the 50th anniversary of D-Day, an event he had attended only under heavy persuasion from his old unit. "I couldn't help but notice," Eleanor continued, gesturing vaguely toward the door. "There was a bit of a commotion with some bikers, and then another group showed up. They seemed to know you." Arthur remained silent. He was a man of few words on the best of days, and he had no interest in becoming the subject of a news story. He had spent his entire life trying to forget the things that made him a hero. He just wanted to be a man. Eleanor sensed his reluctance. She didn't push. Instead, she softened her tone. "Look, sir, I'm not looking to sensationalize anything, but something important happened here today. That kind of standing up for what's right, it doesn't happen much anymore. People need to hear stories like this. It gives them hope." Arthur's eyes softened a little at her words. Hope. That was a word he understood. He had fought for hope. "It was nothing," he finally said, his voice a low, quiet rasp. "Just some boys who forgot their manners." Eleanor smiled, a gentle, genuine smile that wasn't just for her story, but for him. "I don't think it was nothing," she said softly. "The man who led the second group, the big one with the beard, he called you Sergeant." Arthur's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The word was a key to a room he kept locked. "He's an old friend," Arthur said, his voice a little colder. "He also mentioned the 101st Airborne," Eleanor pressed gently. "In Normandy." The other diners were listening now, their attention captured by this new, quiet conversation. Arthur looked around the room at all the faces turned toward him. He saw the respect in their eyes, the admiration, and for the first time, he didn't see it as an intrusion. He saw it as a connection. These people, the ones he shared this town with, they didn't see him as a fragile old man anymore. They saw the strength, the honor, the part of him he had always tried to keep hidden. Maybe, he thought, it wasn't his story to keep to himself. Maybe it belonged to them too. He let out a long, slow breath. A breath that seemed to carry with it the weight of 70 years of memories. He motioned toward the bench seat in his booth. "Sit down," he said. "It's a long story." Eleanor's eyes lit up. She slid into the booth, her camera and recorder ready. Arthur sat down opposite her, his back straight, his hands resting on the table. He didn't look like a man about to be interviewed. He looked like a commander about to give a briefing. "His name is Robert," Arthur began, his voice gaining a little strength. "We call him Brick. He served in the First Gulf War, came back with a lot of demons, like a lot of young men do. He was lost, angry, getting into trouble. I met him here in this very diner about 30 years ago. He was causing a ruckus, not unlike those boys today." Arthur paused, a faint, faraway look in his eyes. "I didn't call the police. I just sat with him, bought him a cup of coffee, told him he was carrying his anger like a heavy rock, and it was only weighing him down. We talked for hours. I didn't tell him what to do. I just listened. And I told him that the only way to honor the things you've been through is to build something good with the life you have left. He looked at Eleanor, his gaze clear and direct. A few years later, he came back to me. He and a few other veterans, men who felt like they didn't fit in anywhere, wanted to start a motorcycle club. But they didn't want it to be about fear and intimidation. They wanted it to be about the things we had learned in the service: brotherhood, honor, discipline. They wanted to be a force for good in their communities. They asked me to be their first president, their sergeant. Eleanor was scribbling furiously in a notepad, her voice recorder capturing every word. I told them my soldiering days were over, Arthur continued, but I said I'd be their advisor. I helped them write their bylaws, their code of conduct. I told them their strength wasn't in the noise of their engines, but in the silence of their respect for others. They weren't just a club. They were a brotherhood. They were the Winged Sentinels, a name I suggested. They were to protect the quiet places, the people who couldn't protect themselves. And Maggie's Diner. This was their first post. He looked around the room again, a faint smile on his lips. They've been watching over this town ever since. They mow the lawns of the elderly. They escort kids on their Halloween trick-or-treating routes. They raise money for families in need. They are the good guys. Eleanor was captivated. This was so much more than she had imagined. It wasn't just a story about a tough old man standing up to bullies. It was a story about a legacy, about the ripples of a single act of kindness spreading out through decades, creating a force for good that was still at work today. So when those boys came in, Eleanor said, piecing it all together. I knew Brick would be close, Arthur said. I knew they wouldn't let anyone disrespect one of their own, especially in a place they've sworn to protect. That phone call wasn't a cry for help. It was a summons. The story was complete. It was a beautiful, powerful tapestry of a life lived with purpose, not just on the battlefield, but in the quiet, everyday moments. Eleanor knew she had something special. This wasn't just an article for the local paper. It was a story that needed to be shared far and wide. Thank you, Arthur, she said, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. Thank you for telling me this. And for your service, both then and now. Arthur just gave a small, humble nod. He looked at the $100 bill still sitting on the counter. Maggie, he called out, his voice a little stronger now, give that money to the food bank. Those boys owe them a debt. McGee smiled, a wide, beautiful smile. You got it, Arthur? Eleanor packed up her things, her mind already racing with how she was going to write the story. She knew it would be a hit. It had everything. A local hero, a band of noble bikers, and a message of hope and honor that the world desperately needed to hear. As she walked out of the diner, she took one last look at the old man sitting in the booth. He wasn't just a war hero. He was a builder. A man who had taken the scars of war and turned them into a foundation for a better world. And she had a feeling that this story, this one small story from a forgotten little town, was about to make a very big noise. Asterisk the morning after the incident. The sun rose over a town that felt the same on the surface, but was humming with a new, vibrant energy underneath. The story of the elderly war hero and the noble bikers wasn't just gossip. It was a modern-day folktale, being told and retold with a sense of pride. When Eleanor Vance's article, The Sentinel and the Soldier, went live online just after midnight, it didn't just inform, it ignited. By dawn, it was spreading far beyond the county's borders. A beacon of decency in a noisy world, Arthur arrived at Maggie's Diner at his usual time. The jingle of the bell seemed to carry a new weight, a new meaning. Every head turned, but the atmosphere was different. It wasn't the tense silence of the day before, or the hushed awe that followed. It was a warm, welcoming tide of pure admiration. Bill, the truck driver who had been a silent fixture for years, actually stood up as Arthur entered, his voice booming with a newfound respect. Morning, Arthur. Morning, Bill, Arthur replied, a small, pleased smile touching his lips. His usual booth was waiting for him, but it had been transformed. A clean mug and a fresh pot of coffee were on the table, as always. But next to them sat a small glass vase filled with wildflowers, their colors bright against the faded red vinyl. Tucked among the stems was a simple hand-drawn card made from a diner napkin. On it, in the clumsy, earnest handwriting of a child, were the words, "Thank you, hero." Arthur looked at the card, and a complex wave of emotions washed over him. He was deeply touched, but also a little overwhelmed. For decades, his greatest skill had been his ability to blend in, to become part of the background. Now, he was the focal point, a local celebrity. He sat down, his movements feeling a bit self-conscious under the gentle, collective gaze of the room. The day's paper was dropped off, and Eleanor's story was on the front page. People at the counter passed it around, pointing at Arthur's picture, slightly blurry. Candid shouted, reading the story aloud in hushed, reverent tones. The article painted a portrait of Arthur that even his longtime neighbors had never fully seen. It spoke of the leadership and burden of command, not the gore of battle. It detailed how one act of kindness to a lost veteran named Brick had blossomed into a force for good, the Winged Sentinels. It was a love letter to quiet decency. Throughout the day, a quiet procession of people came by his table. A young couple, having read the story online, just wanted to shake his hand. An old farmer, he'd known for years, but never spoken to beyond a greeting, sat down in the booth opposite him. And for an hour, they didn't talk about the war at all, but about farming and family, a real conversation for the first time. Arthur found himself talking more than he had in years, his dry wit and gentle wisdom flowing freely. He answered questions about the importance of community, of looking out for one another, and how the loudest person in the room is often the weakest. He was a natural storyteller, and the town was finally listening. The story's impact was rippling outwards in other ways. Brick and the Winged Sentinels started getting phone calls from all over the country. Veterans who felt lost reached out, inspired by their code of honor. Other motorcycle clubs, ones with similar principles, reached out to offer their support and brotherhood. The small-town chapter was no longer just a local group. They were becoming a symbol of what a biker club could and should be. The most significant change, however, was happening within the Vipers. Spike and his crew hadn't just fled the town. They had fled their own reflections. The story of their public humiliation had spread through their circles. And they were pariahs, mocked not for being tough, but for being exposed as bullies. A week after the incident, Spike drove back to Maggie's diner. He was alone. He was on his motorcycle, but it felt different. The loud, aggressive exhaust had been replaced with a quiet, standard one. He wasn't wearing his Viper's vest. He was just a young man in a plain jacket. He parked his bike across the street and just sat there for a long time, watching the diner. He saw people coming and going, a steady, peaceful stream. He saw Arthur through the window, talking with a group of people, a gentle smile on his face. Finally, Spike got off his bike and walked across the street. His heart was pounding. He pushed open the door to the diner, and the bell jangled. A few people looked up, their expressions wary but not hostile. Arthur, who was in the middle of a conversation, looked over and saw him. He didn't look angry or alarmed. He just gave a small, almost unnoticeable nod, and then turned his attention back to his company. Giving Spike the space he needed, Spike walked over to the counter. Maggie was there, wiping it down. She looked at him, her expression neutral. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but professional. "I wanted to apologize to you, and to everyone," Spike said, his voice low and sincere. "For the trouble we caused, it won't happen again." Maggie looked at him for a long moment, searching his face. She saw the change in him. He wasn't the same cocky kid who had swaggered in a week ago. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. "Apology accepted," she said simply. "We all make stupid mistakes when we're young. What matters is what you learn from them." Spike seemed to relax a little. He looked over at Arthur's booth. The part about him just listening to Brick, that's the part that got me, he admitted. He could have called the cops. He could have had him thrown in jail. But he gave him a chance to be better. Sees the good in people, even when they can't see it themselves, Maggie said softly. He gives you a chance to rise too. Spike nodded slowly, the words sinking in. He thought about his own life, the anger he always carried, the need to prove himself. He realized he had been carrying his own heavy rock, just like Brick had. He looked back at Arthur, and for the first time, he didn't see a living legend. He just saw a good man. A man who offered a lesson, not a punishment. With a final, grateful look, Spike turned and left the diner. He didn't get on his bike and ride off. He started walking down the street toward the town's small community center. A new, quiet purpose had entered his life. Life in the town settled into a new rhythm, but the normal was different. It was richer, deeper. Arthur still came to Maggie's every day at 3 o'clock. He still sat in his corner booth. But now his booth was rarely empty. He had become the town's quiet heart, its unofficial historian, its gentle conscience. The one phone call he had made hadn't just changed an afternoon. It had pulled a community together, given a young man a new direction, and shown everyone that the greatest strength isn't in the roar of an engine, but in the quiet, steady beat of a heart that chooses to be kind. In Maggie's diner, thanks to one quiet soldier, peace had finally and beautifully found its voice.